Hello and welcome to our weekly Bible reading video. This week we encounter some difficult stories as we approach the ending of the book of Genesis. We're really into the last movement, and it begins with a couple of difficult stories to deal with, but they do connect, as hard as it is to see at first, they do connect with the major themes that are coming across as we go from the stories of Jacob to the stories of Jacob's family. You'll see in the beginning of our readings for this week that Jacob is settling in what will become the promised land of the future, and he even takes some money and buys a plot of that land. This is the last settlement of Abraham's descendants before the reconquest or the coming to the land under Joshua. Of course, we will see as we progress in the book of Genesis that eventually Jacob and all of his family will settle in Egypt. And so they will be away from the promised land for 400 years before they come back with the Exodus and Moses leading the people, and then Joshua leading them actually into the promised land. So what we're seeing in the first part of our readings today is the claim that the descendants of Jacob are going to make on this land. That God has affirmed the promise of this land, that Jacob has settled back into this land, that he has even bought a parcel of land. And then we get this very disturbing and different story about the rape of Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and how his sons, Dinah's brothers, react to this injustice. And this story really seeks to solidify the claim that the Israelites are going to have on the land, even though it uses this backstory which is difficult to read. You'll notice in this story of Dinah that there is a lot of language around the idea of defilement. And defilement meant something very specific in the life of the Israelites. Remember that the people who are writing these stories down are writing them down from memory, from probably having these stories told from generation to generation. They're looking back at these stories, and they're looking back at them from a time when they have the law, the ceremonial law, which spoke very deeply about the idea of purity versus defilement. And so while on the surface you are getting the obvious defilement that comes with this horrible act that happens to Dinah, you are also getting the symbolic defilement that comes from the Canaanites. Canaanites were seen as unclean people that later on, when Joshua brings the Israelites into the promised land and defeats the Canaanites, they are being called to completely destroy the Canaanites and the Canaanite culture, which has this very long temptation of defiling the people of Israel, especially with idolatry. And so while we're speaking of defilement of a sexual injustice that is happening to Dinah on one hand, we're also talking about the general defilement of the Canaanites and later justification for the Israelites to eliminate the Canaanites from this promised land. This idea of purity and defilement helps us understand even some of the later laws that come up in the law of Moses. For instance, the prohibition against pork is not just a willy-nilly decision by God, not wanting his people to eat the meat of the pig that is obviously, we know as South Georgians, a very delicious thing to eat. But because the Canaanites were pig farmers, and God wanted to keep the Israelites away from the Canaanites and from their way of life. So one way to do that was to say, don't defile yourself with eating the things that they are known to raise and farm and eat themselves. And so in this sense, we're seeing that God wants to keep the Israelites pure and away from the Canaanites. Well, what does this have to do with Dinah? You see here with the brothers of Dinah, the sons of Jacob, their plan is to trick the Canaanites into thinking that the Israelites want to enter into an agreement with them not only to forgive them for this horrible offense against Dinah, but also to become one people with the Canaanites. They are able to trick the Canaanites into thinking that if the Canaanites will just take on this mark of circumcision, then they will become one with the Israelites. And they do this not out of any altruistic sense. The Canaanites, that is, they agree to this plan not because they are just very generous, welcoming people. We've already seen their character in the horrible offense that they have committed against Dinah. But their true motives are revealed in this passage when they say, "These people are friendly with us. Let them live in the land and trade in it, for the land is large enough for them. Let us take their daughters in marriage, and let us give them our daughters. Only on this condition will they agree to live among us, to become one people. Will not their livestock, their property, and all their animals be ours?" So in other words, the Canaanites are wanting to absorb the Israelites into their culture. So the Israelites will no longer become a distinct people, a pure people, as the law would later call them, and so that they could take the goods, take the richness of this family of Jacob. Now, what is implied in this is that even though they're taking the mark of Israel's covenant faith, what is implied in them becoming one is that Israel will also accept and receive the gods of the Canaanites. We see later on in the next chapter, Jacob tells his sons, put away the foreign gods. So they obviously have already transgressed this boundary and started to accept the Canaanite culture of idolatry and polytheism. This is exactly what the Israelites don't want to do. This is what God has called them away from. That's why God has given them all those purity laws, so they wouldn't mix with the Canaanites. Now, obviously, we see that this whole plan was a trick by the sons of Jacob. And as the men get circumcised and as they're recovering from that and unable to fight, Jacob's sons go and murder the Canaanite men and take all of their possessions, even taking their women and children to be a part then of their community. This is not a great look for the Israelites. Even Jacob himself recognizes this at the end of the passage. This is definitely not a good look for the Canaanites. They are definitely the villains in the beginning of the story with the rape of Dinah. And really no one comes out of this looking innocent except maybe for poor Dinah herself. But what this is intended to show, especially later generations of the Israelites, is that we are serious as a people about not mixing with the Canaanites. They want to cast the Canaanites in a bad light, and they want to show them as people that are impure, people that are defiled, people that should not remain in the promised land. While that may not make sense to us as 21st century Americans who really don't have a position in this Canaanite versus Israelite conflict, it is important to have in the Old Testament scriptures, in the Hebrew scriptures, for the people of Israel as another justification for their rights in the promised land and why they had to separate themselves from the Canaanites. This was very important to build their case for later on in the Old Testament, that they are not to be defiled in any way by the Canaanites and their culture and their religion. The story at the end of our readings for this week is also another one of those difficult stories that we might think, why in the world is this in the Bible? What does it have to teach us at all? And that is the story of Judah and Tamar, his daughter-in-law, whom he impregnates because she tricks him into having a child with her. And just very messy family dynamics, things that we would probably rather not read about, and things that we would be okay with if they had left them out of the Bible. But we may not see it at first, and it may seem like this weird interlude because we've started the story of Joseph right before this, but actually the story of Judah and Tamar connects with the story of Joseph and his brothers, because both of them are stories of Jacob's sons, Joseph's brothers, perpetrating an injustice against someone who has fewer rights and fewer and smaller standing in that culture. Let's start with the story of Joseph and see how he is taken advantage of by his brothers, and then that will help shed a little bit of light on the story of Tamar. We read that Joseph is the 11th of 12 brothers. You can't get much more lower on the totem pole than 11th of 12, because even if you're 12th of 12, you're at least the baby. But 11th of 12, you are just lost at the bottom. You don't have any respect from your other brothers. And keep in mind something, that the 10 older brothers of Joseph do not share a mother with Joseph. Joseph and Benjamin, the youngest, are the only children of Rachel. And remember that Rachel was the wife of Jacob that Jacob loved the most. She was the preferred wife. So you have the preferred sons of the preferred wife who are getting special treatment, and you can understand why the 10 other brothers are not very fond of Joseph, especially the brothers who are children of the maids of Leah and Rachel. We hear in the first part of chapter 37 that the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, those were the maids, the concubines of Jacob, that they were given a bad report to their father Jacob from Joseph. So they have extra reason to dislike him. But also Joseph is given this coat that we have traditionally been told is a coat of many colors, a coat of bright colors, but some more recent scholarship on the language of this story shows that that might have been a coat with long sleeves. And that's important because you didn't go out and work in the fields wearing a coat of long sleeves. You would wear a coat of long sleeves if you were someone who was kept inside, kept away from hard work, and that you were given preferential treatment. It was a garment that showed that you were given that preferential treatment. So Joseph not only is the beloved son of the beloved wife, he not only has given a bad report on his brothers, but he is the favored son who doesn't have to do all the hard work and gets to stay inside while the others go outside and work. Think of Jacob and Esau. Remember, Jacob was that preferred son of his mother who stayed inside while Esau went out and hunted. And then, of course, Joseph gives these dreams to his brothers. He reveals that he's having these dreams in which his brothers and his family basically are bowing down before him. Now, these dreams, of course, will play a bigger part later on in the story of Joseph. But as you can see here, Joseph is not doing himself any favors. He does not have the love and the admiration of his brothers in the way that he does his father. And so there's a lot of jealousy here. And so they perpetrate this injustice against him, where at first they want to kill him, but then they decide to sell him into slavery. And Joseph really has no appeal here. He's the younger brother. He's being younger, he is the weaker party, and he has no legal standing as the 11th of 12 brothers. And so he is taken advantage of. Now switch over to the story of Tamar. Tamar also has no legal standing in this culture because of her position as a woman. And unfortunately, women's rights was not a thing back then in Israelite culture and Canaanite culture. And so she has been promised that she will have a husband who can take care of her, who will provide a child for her. This is her social security in that culture. To be a woman without a husband or a child to take care of you meant that you had no way to support yourself once you had left your father's house. She had left her father's house to go into Judah's house to marry Judah's son. And Judah's son has died. Now, we don't yet have the law of Levirate marriage, but what that law will say later on in the Old Testament is what obviously was already a custom in that culture, that if you are the wife of a brother, of an older brother, and that older brother dies, his next brother in line is to take you as his wife and provide children for you in the name of that older brother. If that brother then dies, then the next brother is supposed to take that position as your husband. Again, this is a way to not only secure the position of the woman, but also to secure the household and inheritance of the oldest brother. Jesus is offered a question by the Sadducees about this idea of Levirate marriage in the Gospels, and he expertly weaves his way through what they think is a trap for him. But this is later to be codified in the Mosaic Law, but it is a cultural reality already. And Judah does not fulfill his place as the father of these brothers by continuing to provide Tamar with a husband. So Judah had not lived into his responsibilities of continuing to provide that husband for Tamar after her first two husbands had died. And so he is perpetrating an injustice against her that is going to harm her social standing and her ability even to live in that culture and take care of herself. So while the circumstances are completely different, the focus is still here on two people being taken advantage of by people in higher positions of authority and power, and how that injustice is not acceptable to God. We'll need to get that longer range view of Joseph's story to see how God redeems this instance of injustice. But we see here in this one short chapter in the story of Tamar how God redeems her and shows her to be the one who is just, and the one who, even though she tricked her father-in-law into having a child with her, she is actually the one who has lived justly and been seen and been honored by God, because God takes care of victims of injustice. That's the main point here, and that's what we need to remember. God cares for the oppressed, and God's justice is working for the good of those who have been victims of injustice at the hands of other people. And so that might twist our modern sensibilities a little bit, because we see we may be focused more on the sexual nature of the sin of Judah, and may even see Tamar as being sinful because of her sexual actions. Because in our culture, we think much more moralistically in ways that seem to put personal conduct sins as being more serious than sins of injustice and oppression. But it reminds us that God sees injustice and oppression as very grave sins. Not that God doesn't see those personal moral character choices as important sins or grave sins. But let's not forget how God deeply disapproves of taking advantage of people and perpetrating injustice. God is the God of moral righteousness, yes, and God is also the God of justice for all people. So these may again have been difficult stories to look at this week, but they do have an important function, especially for the people of Israel. The first story more so for the identity of Israel within this foreign culture. The second story may speak to our culture a little bit more than the first one, but it's to remind us to fight for justice, because God's kingdom is a kingdom in which the oppressed are set free. Continue reading. We're going to enter into the story of Joseph more deeply. This is a very important story for the Old Testament and the future of the people of Israel. And it's an enjoyable story, so I hope that you'll enjoy it as we go forward in our readings. Have a great week, and I'll see you soon.